So, history is much more an art than a science. It is a reconstruction by a historian who uses the materials of evidence in the same way that a painter uses paints. In this way, he reconstructs his version of the past, and if it is sufficiently persuasive, he convinces other people that that's what happened. Various sneaky governments have caught on to this and realized that they can write their own official history about anything. Then, they've got a doctrine, a kind of historical destiny or compulsion, that claims certain things as a result of history must happen. They use this to justify what they're going to do anyway. Nowhere is this more apparent in scholarship than in historical studies of the four Gospels and the life of Jesus. If you study all the great scholars, say from 850 to the present day, who have examined the New Testament from a historical point of view, you'll find that every one of them has a different history. Each scholar sees the texts from their own particular perspective, wanting to present Jesus in a specific way. They've got excellent reasons for rejecting all those parts of the text that don't agree with their interpretation and accepting those that do. And, in a way, they cancel each other out. So, from a sensory point of view, we know that just as you cannot point to the difference between yourself and others, you cannot find the past. Equally, you cannot find the future. Neither the past nor the future exists in the present moment. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. So then, you have a situation that is eternal. From the beginning of any form whatsoever, whether it was mineral, gaseous, an amoeba, a plant, an animal, or a human being, it has always been involved in a process. Or, even if it didn't know it was involved in that process, where does the individual form begin and end? Where do you draw the line? Let's say we have a vibration like this. Yes, you can point to the tangent, draw tangents along the top of all the curves, and call this the crest. But the crest is where the wave is most, and the trough is where it is least. You see at once that you can't have the wave if you don't have both the crest and the trough. Every time it goes crest trough, that's the wave. So what is a wave, then? We see in the image of throwing a stone into a pool that there isn't a wave. There is waving. There is really no individual wave. You think you see an individual wave going out like that, but it's just the movement. Take a piece of cloth, spread it out on a table, then push it together so that you get a fold across the center. Now move your hands so that the folding happens all the way across. The cloth doesn't move, the folding does. Can you pin it down and say it's an entity? You can't. In exactly the same way, all of human history, from our earliest imaginable ancestors until now, is standing still in the same place. It's doing the same thing over and over again, coming back each time in such a way as to give us the notion that it's new. You are your fathers and grandfathers from millions of years ago. You might say, they were sitting around in skins using stone implements, but from the perspective of someone a million years hence, we're still sitting around in skins using stone tools. The people of the past were always present, and when they sat around in caves with stone implements and skins, they had ways of relating to one another as qualitatively subtle as ours. They had perceptions and ways of being that we wouldn't even know how to look for. So-called primitive people have a very, very high culture. It's just structured differently, on a different wavelength than ours. But it is just as human and authentic. We have the illusion that history keeps changing, getting better or worse. But that's the same kind of illusion as the apparent motion of the wave across the water. Now let's see how Dogen puts it. He has some vivid ideas. If we are washed ashore while sailing, we might feel that the shore is moving. But if we look closer to the boat itself, we know it is the boat that moves. When we regard the universe with confusion of body and mind, we often get the mistaken belief that our mind is constant. But if we actually practice and reflect inwardly, we see that this was wrong. When firewood becomes ashes, it never returns to being firewood. But we should not take the view that what is now ashes was once firewood. Instead, we should understand that, according to Buddhist doctrine, firewood stays in the position of firewood, and ashes stay in the position of ashes. There are stages in life, and these stages are clearly distinct. It is the same with life and death. Thus, in Buddhism, we say the unborn is also the undying. Life is a position of time, and death is a position of time. They are like winter and spring. This, then, is the last seminar in the series of seminars on the future, devoted to the subject of the future of politics. All along I've been emphasizing a particular point, which is this: the very idea of the future has something spurious in it. To live for the future is an indefinite postponement of the moment of life. The great political systems of the Western world, whether capitalist or communist, are based on the notion that what we live for is the future. And this is a very funny thing, especially when you think about Marxism. The Marxists have always said that religion is the opium of the people because it's based on the idea of pie in the sky when you die. But, in fact, the politics of Marxism are just as much about pie in the sky. It's always a 5-year plan for something to turn up later, something that will be better than what we have now. In exactly the same way, our notions of the Great Society are based on a futurist approach to life. In our education, we go through a whole series of steps. The word in Latin, gradus, means a step. So we have first grade, second grade, gradus, gradus, gradus. I'm a graduate. You've climbed the steps, but you're still doing it. Finally, when you become successful as the president of your corporation, you may have a funny feeling of being cheated. You climbed the stairway, got to the top, and there's nowhere else to go. And since you've never been taught to live in the present, you don't know what to do. So, an insurance salesman comes around and says, "Listen, I've got the very thing for you, a retirement program, because when you're 65, you'll drop out of the system, and then you'll really be able to enjoy yourself, despite your prostate trouble, menopause, false teeth, and everything else." The art of living in the eternal now is not taught in our educational system. It's not taught because it's thought of as being feckless and irresponsible. But it isn't irresponsible at all. It is, in fact, everybody's duty to enjoy themselves. If you don't do that, you become a nuisance. You become aggressive, a robber, a thief. You become someone trying to organize the rest of the world, in other words, a power maniac, simply because you haven't learned the very simple, inexpensive art of living in the present moment. It really doesn't take an awful lot of energy to maintain a human life. If you truly consider what you need to eat, what you need to wear, and how much housing you actually require, it boils down to something quite simple. The simpler your life is, the more capacity you have to enjoy something as small as a raindrop crawling down a window pane. But if you watch that raindrop and say, "My, look at that. Everybody else says you're crazy. Why are you watching a raindrop? Go do something important." And that's where the trouble begins. The mentality that doesn't recognize the importance of watching a raindrop crawl down a window is the one creating the trouble in the world today. I had an astounding session just a day or two ago with the chief of a Western Shoshone Indian tribe, located roughly around central Nevada. He explained how the US government is seriously trying to erase the Indian way of life, particularly through a bill that allows Indians to borrow money on their land. When he finished telling his story, I asked him, "Well, what do you want us to do about it?" He said, "That's the wrong question. I knew this was coming." He continued, "You pale faces, you white people, you always think about doing something. That's what's the matter with you." So I said, "Yeah, that's the problem." He responded, "We're going to do something about it, but not on your terms. We expect you to be sensible enough to correct your own actions. We're not going to fight you in the ordinary way, not on your terms." And he said something more. "We are in harmony with the earth, the geography, the sky, and the waters of this land. You'll find there will be more and more tornadoes, earthquakes, and natural disasters because you are violating nature. You are destroying it, and it will fight back. We are not strangers on this land. We are one with it, the same process as the land itself. And it's not just us in North America. We're in touch with the Indians in Peru, Chile, Brazil. We are one great family. We're just waiting for you invaders from the West, from Europe, to strangle yourselves and get rid of yourselves. Let's go back to an early stage of our development, when human beings transitioned from being hunters to being farmers. This is a very critical stage in the history of technology. When we were hunters, every male knew the whole culture. In other words, he had to fend for himself, to make his own clothes, create his weapons, know the arts of hunting, and even be in charge of his own religion. Their way was peculiarly religious. Hunting cultures often had medicine men, and the interesting thing about a medicine man, as distinct from a priest, is that he is not ordained by anybody else. He doesn't have to be approved by a guru, an organization, or a church. He goes away alone into the forest and gets his own thing. He may contact what he calls the ancestors, but he has to do it by himself. Now, when a community settles, instead of being a roving, hunting people living in the forests, and they form a village, a great change occurs. Where do villages and towns arise? Often, where a road crosses a river, or where two roads intersect. Around these junctions, originally just hunting tracks or trails, a stockade is built. This is called the pale. You might have heard the phrase beyond the pale, meaning someone is an outsider. The term comes from palos, the tree posts used to make the stockade. Inside the stockade, society divides into 4 blocks of roles. It is the essence of an agricultural society, distinct from a hunting culture, to specialize and divide labor. When labor divides itself, it typically forms 4 major groups: the Brahmins, the brains, the thinkers, the idea people; the Kshatriyas, the brawn, the military men who defend the community; the Vaishyas, the merchants and traders; the Shudras, the craftsmen and skilled workers. Outside the pale, there are those without particular qualifications, the low outcasts, often untouchables. However, there is another curious group. These people are also outside the pale but are respected for their position. In Sanskrit, they are called Shramana, akin to the word shaman. In Chinese, they are referred to as chamin, meaning an immortal who lives alone in the mountains. These people retain the values of the hunting culture. They say, when you settle down in the city, the polis, and divide labor, you start to assume roles. You put on a mask and say, I'm a soldier, or I'm a priest. But in the process, you start to forget your true self. The word person itself means mask, from the Latin persona, referring to the masks worn by actors in Greco-Roman drama. And so, in the polis, people are taught to believe they are their roles. For example, I was taught by my mother that I was Alan Watts, and I've never been able to fully recover from it. In ancient Indian customs, it was recognized that you play a role only for a while. Once you've raised your children and fulfilled your social duties, you must prepare for death. Death, when you're playing a role, seems like a tremendous threat. You think, what's going to become of me? But the teaching is, that doesn't matter. To face death with dignity, you must know who you really are. To do that, you withdraw from your role. You become what's called vanaprastha, which means forest dweller, as opposed to grahastha, the householder. This withdrawal may take many forms. Could mean retiring to a cottage, going into the jungle, or even renouncing your possessions to sit by the river. You give up your name. You might become nameless or take on a divine name, one of God's names. There are people in the United States today trying to do this. Some are called hippies. I met one the other night and asked his name. He said, my name is you. He absolutely refused to acknowledge any other name. Well, great. Okay. You're you. When you become vanaprastha, you concentrate your psychic energy to find out what's really going on, what existence itself is. You do this by paying attention. You might meditate on sound, light, or even stillness to discover their essence. When you truly understand, you stop being anxious. You see that politics and social arrangements, the polis, are temporary games of social life. These roles, while necessary, are not ultimate reality. The polis is a kind of play like dancing. It has its styles, waltzes, rumbas, foxtrots, and each is legitimate in its own way. But the shramana or sannyasin reminds people inside the polis that it's all just a game. Don't take it too seriously, they say. If you do, you'll end up destroying each other. Fighting city against city, country against country. A sane society allows for some people to step outside the game. Monks, outsiders, those who don't identify with a role. In contrast, an insecure society insists that everyone must belong, work, and conform. In such societies, freedom disappears. Some worry, what if everyone withdrew? But that's unlikely. Most people are deeply fascinated by the game and remain eager to play. Those who withdraw serve as reminders of the greater reality, ensuring balance. So, a society that can tolerate its outsiders is strong and confident. It knows that not everyone has to agree or participate in the same way. That's the essence of democracy. The freedom to say, you have a right to do things your way.